Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
During her party, my mother stood in the middle of the living room like a queen on her throne, smiling in that sly way she always did when she felt like she was winning, as if everyone else existed only to serve as the audience for her performance. The house smelled of roasted meat and cheap champagne, the kind she insisted was just as good as the expensive brands, though we all knew she had plenty of money to buy the real thing if she wanted to. My relatives were scattered around the room, cousins sipping from plastic cups, my brother laughing too loudly, and my father standing in his usual spot near the window, looking like he wished he could fade into the curtains. I had already learned over the years that these gatherings were less about family and more about her power. Every joke was a test, every compliment a veiled insult, every toast a reminder of who controlled the narrative. It was just as I had predicted when the evening turned toward me, because somehow it always did. My mother tilted her glass, raised her eyebrows, and with a smirk sharp enough to slice open skin, she announced to everyone present, "You'll never see a cent from me. You're nothing but a disappointment." The words fell out casually, almost lazily, as though she were commenting on the weather, but the laughter that followed was tight and uneasy. Even my brother, who usually found great pleasure in my humiliation, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing at me the way a man might glance at a fuse burning down into a stick of dynamite. For years, I had swallowed these moments, choking on the humiliation while pretending it didn't matter, and for years, she had grown stronger with every time I stayed silent. But something about the way she looked at me that night, the smug curl of her lips as though she had secured her final victory, forced me into a clarity I hadn't expected. I didn't flinch, I didn't lower my eyes, and I didn't let the silence claim me. Instead, I lifted my glass slowly, tasted the bitter champagne on my tongue, and let my voice cut through the room like a blade sliding across porcelain. Good thing I'm leaving the country forever. The shift was immediate, like the sound of glass breaking in a church. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, laughter froze in throats, and even the clatter of a fork against a plate seemed to hang in the air as though time had been paused by some invisible hand. My mother's smirk faltered, her face twitching as though she couldn't quite process what I had said, and the color drained from her cheeks in a way that almost made me pity her, almost. Around me, I could feel the eyes of every relative boring into my skin, waiting for me to laugh, to admit it was a joke, to collapse back into the role I had always played, the silent one, the forgiving one, the daughter who could be humiliated without consequence. But I didn't laugh, and I didn't soften the words. I let them hang there, heavy and unrelenting, filling the silence with a weight no one could ignore. My father shifted, clearing his throat as though he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the courage, while my brother muttered something under his breath, though even he didn't sound convinced of his own dismissal. The truth was simple. They had all grown so accustomed to the story my mother had written about me that the idea of me stepping off the stage entirely was unthinkable. And yet here I was, saying it plainly, tearing a hole in the carefully painted backdrop she had spent decades perfecting. I remember the way my hand trembled slightly as I set down my glass, not from fear, but from the surge of adrenaline that comes when you realize you've crossed a line you can never step back over. The silence stretched long enough for me to enjoy the sight of my mother's face collapsing, her eyes darting nervously toward her guests, searching for a lifeline, some sign that the audience was still on her side. But there was nothing. Only uncomfortable shifting, the faint clink of ice melting in glasses, and the echo of my words repeating in the space she had once controlled with such ease. She tried, of course. She forced out a laugh, brittle and sharp, saying something about how dramatic I had always been, how I loved to spin tales to make myself feel important. But the damage was done. The mask she wore so proudly had cracked, and I had seen it. More importantly, everyone else had too. They might not have believed me entirely, but they had watched her stumble, and that was enough to tip the balance, even just a little. As the party limped on, I excused myself with the kind of calm that only comes when you know you've played your card and it landed exactly as you wanted. I walked down the hallway toward the door, feeling the eyes following me, whispers starting to stir like dry leaves in the wind. For once, I didn't feel like the embarrassment, the burden, or the disappointment. I felt like the storm on the horizon, silent, sure, and impossible to ignore. And yet, as I stepped outside into the cold night air, the echo of her words still followed me, clinging to me like smoke. You'll never see a cent from me. Maybe she was right. Maybe I never would. But what she didn't know, and what made my lips curl into the smallest of smiles as I walked away, was that I had already started building something she couldn't touch, something she couldn't buy, and something she would never be able to destroy. The party was still alive inside, muffled laughter and clinking glasses spilling faintly through the windows, but none of it mattered anymore. I had said what I needed to say, and the silence that followed me was worth more than all the money she had ever hoarded. Still, I couldn't shake the thought. What would happen the next time I saw her face, and would she dare smirk again, knowing I had finally stepped out of the cage she built for me? The morning after the party arrived like a hangover, even though I had barely touched the champagne, because what lingered was not alcohol, but the metallic taste of humiliation finally refused. And as I lay awake in the thin light of early day, I realized how many years of these performances I had sat through while convincing myself I was strong for surviving them, when the truth was simpler and uglier. That survival is not the same as living, and endurance is not the same as respect. I drove to Aunt Linda's tiny bungalow because she was the only person in our family who spoke without turning words into weapons, and while she set down a mug of coffee that tasted like an apology she never made me ask for, she watched my face and said she had once tried to tell me something but backed off when my mother started sniffing around her bank statements, which would have sounded paranoid if we were talking about anyone other than Carol, a woman who thought control was love and secrecy was a virtue. Linda reminded me of a summer when I was barely out of high school and had been working 2 jobs to save for tuition because I had believed the line about money being tight this year, and how around that same time a little nest egg from my grandmother had been quietly parked into something called an education fund that never actually paid a bill with my name on it. And as she spoke, I remembered my mother's slippery explanations about market fluctuations and timing and the way opportunities could be wasted on the wrong degree, which at the time had felt like a conversation about economics, but now revealed itself as an argument about obedience. I left Linda's with a manila envelope of photocopies she had taken years ago under the naive assumption that paper still mattered, and I sat in my car flipping through statements that showed a fund created when I was a teenager, deposits that matched the exact dates of my grandmother's gifts, and then a slow, careful drainage that aligned perfectly with my brother Ethan's emergency semesters and unplanned internships, the kind that come with apartment deposits and laptop upgrades and a semester abroad that my mother had insisted was a cultural investment, all while I was being told to be grateful for community college because a practical girl needs a practical education. I thought of my father standing by the window at the party as if the glass might let him slide out of the room unnoticed, and I wondered whether silence could be measured like currency, and if so, whether he had ever learned the exchange rate between peace and a daughter's future. The anger that rose in me was not loud, though I wanted it to be. It was dense, like steam under a lid. And I understood with a steadiness that felt frightening that if I confronted my mother outright, she would shapeshift into the persecuted matriarch, and I would once again become the ungrateful child who couldn't add, subtract, or see the big picture. So I did not confront her. I prepared instead, because planning has a way of clearing the fog that outrage lays down, and when you grow up with a person who collects secrets the way other people collect hobbies, you learn that the quiet movement of your hands counts more than the volume of your voice. I ordered my birth certificate and a certified copy of my grandmother's will. I requested an audit trail on the so-called education account, because banks do not care about family politics, they care about signatures. And I opened a new email and a new phone line attached to only my name, because the first step of leaving is removing the ropes you can't see. That afternoon I sat at my small kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down the invisible ways I had been propping up the image that allowed my mother to play queen, the recurring auto-pay I had set up 2 years ago when she claimed to have misplaced her debit card during the country club's renewal window, the streaming packages I had added after she complained the news anchors on her basic plan looked cheap, the floral subscription I had gifted monthly to her doorstep because it was easier to buy roses than to fight about gratitude. And I understood that my first revenge didn't need to draw blood. It just needed to make the mirror tell the truth. By evening, while my mother was surely replaying the party and stitching together a new narrative in which my announcement had been a cry for attention rather than a declaration of independence, I logged into the country club portal and removed my card. Not with a dramatic flourish, but with the competent click of a person reclaiming their breath, and then I paused, reread the terms, and scheduled an email to the membership office written in the polite, efficient tone my mother loves to adopt when she is correcting waitstaff, where I explained that as the payer of record for the last 2 years I would be discontinuing support effective immediately, and that any inquiries about the delinquent dues should be directed to Carol, who preferred personal calls. Then I canceled the floral deliveries and let the streaming packages lapse, and for dessert I printed the bank's confirmation that my audit request had been logged, because nothing tastes sweeter than a clock quietly starting in a room your opponent doesn't know exists. I did not gloat, and I did not call. I simply set a reminder to watch the calendar, knowing that in a week the bouquet would not arrive, in 2 weeks the club would call, and by the end of the month someone in a blazer would say her name in a tone she had never heard from anyone she could not control. And when my phone buzzed with a message from Ethan asking whether I had really meant what I said about leaving because Mom was kind of freaking out, I typed slowly that I was busy, that I would call later, and then I put the phone face down. Because the nicest part of revenge, when done correctly, is how ordinary the final act can feel, like washing a dish, like turning a key, like crossing a room and opening a door you have always been told was locked. By the 3rd day after the party, I had learned that silence can be an instrument rather than a void when you hold it in your hands deliberately and tune it to the frequency of the person who believes she hears everything first. So I drove to the bank in the late morning and sat across from a young compliance officer with careful hair and an expression that said she had been trained to look sympathetic without promising anything, and as I slid across the notarized request for transaction histories on the education account that had supposedly been created for my benefit, I felt the odd calm of someone placing a marker on a table, not to gamble, but to count, because counting is where stories either hold up or collapse. The officer frowned in that polite way that suggests concern without intimacy, typed for a long time, excused herself, returned with a man whose suit cost what a practical girl might have spent on a semester of books, and together they explained that, yes, a custodial account had been opened in my name many years ago, and, yes, the founding deposit matched a bequest amount that would have paid for a modest university, and then some. But the signature trail showed an authorization sequence that permitted transfers for family education purposes, a phrase that sounded fair until you looked at the dates, which was exactly what I asked to do, and then the numbers lined up with my brother's internships and his semester abroad and the laptop that gleamed in family photos while I was cobbling together secondhand machines that coughed when I opened spreadsheets. I did not raise my voice and I did not cry, because both reactions would have satisfied the version of me my mother prefers to cite when she needs a cautionary tale, and instead I asked for copies, affidavits, and the contact information for the internal auditor who would, according to policy and my new favorite phrase, determine beneficiary harm, which made something inside me unclench with a small and private click, not because money would return. Money rarely walks home once it has been taught to run, but because a paper wind had started to blow in a direction my mother does not know how to sail against. On the way back to my apartment, I called Aunt Linda and told her, in the driest voice I could manage, that the bank had used the words "further review," and she gave a short laugh that sounded like a chair being pulled back from a table at last, then warned me with the tenderness of someone who has seen a storm build that Carol would not go quiet, but would instead escalate through a predictable series of maneuvers, the first being a claim that I was unstable and therefore needed monitoring for my own good, which translated in our family dialect to rummaging through my life until she found the thing she could hold hostage. I discovered precisely which hostage she preferred when I unlocked my apartment door, tossed my keys in the ceramic bowl shaped like a leaf I had bought at a thrift store, and opened the closet where I keep a fireproof pouch that holds my birth certificate. Social security card, and passport, because any person who grows up with a mother like mine learns to keep proof of existence in one place. And as I unzipped the pouch, I felt the immediate drop in my stomach that has nothing to do with intuition and everything to do with absence, since the passport sleeve lay there like a shed skin with nothing inside it, and for a moment I simply stared at the gap where the little book should have nestled, blue and indifferent, while my brain traced and retraced the steps of the last week looking for a mistake I could forgive myself for. I did not find one, which meant someone had made themselves at home inside my home, and while a part of me wanted to run to the building office and demand footage and key logs, the larger, colder part of me understood that documenting a violation would not prevent the next one, whereas converting it into leverage might. I called the passport agency, reported the document as missing, scheduled the earliest replacement appointment I could find, and requested a formal loss report, which felt like laying down a chess piece that announces not just the current move, but the path of the next three. Revenge arrived that evening dressed as administrative housekeeping, which is to say I opened the folder in my email where old obligations live and finally dealt with the relic that had been sitting there like a stone in a shoe for years. The cosigner authorization I had given Ethan on his lease when our mother claimed that family helps family and pressed me on the shoulder with the smile she saves for photos, and I gathered the original documents, read the exit clause twice, and then called the lender to initiate a removal request based on timely payments and the borrower's current income, which would force a reassessment at renewal that could be met if he had been honest about his raises, or could be declined if he had not. And either way the arrangement would no longer feed on my credit like ivy climbing an old fence. I wrote the required notice in a tone so courteous it felt surgical, attached the proof they requested, and when I hit send I thought of the look on my brother's face when the lender called to say the file was changing shape, not to punish him, because he is a symptom more than a cause, but to remind him that the hand he had bitten for a decade could, without fanfare, be withdrawn. Which is a lesson our mother never taught because she enjoys making dependence look like generosity. I slept with the living room lamp on like a child who trusts light to keep monsters at bay, and in the blue hour just before morning my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that included a photo of my passport lying open on my mother's marble counter next to a slice of cake with a fork stuck in it. The kind of tableau she creates when she wants to look careless while saying something careful, accompanied by a message that read, in the precise grammar she wields as a blade, that she had found my travel document among your things and would, of course, keep it safe because she was terribly worried about my emotional state and did not think international travel was wise right now, especially with important family matters pending, which was a phrase that could mean anything from a meeting with her lawyer to a new narrative she had already started telling the cousins. I stared at the photo long enough to feel my heartbeat slow into something useful, and then I typed a reply that thanked her for her concern and suggested she drop it at the police station for secure handling since it was now officially reported missing and therefore the property of a federal agency during replacement. A statement that was both truthful and subtly radioactive, and as the little dots on the screen pulsed while she considered how to answer without revealing that she had trespassed into my life like it was her pantry, I realized that the next move would not be made by text at all, because I had an envelope on my table addressed to the bank's auditor with photocopies Aunt Linda had kept for years, and once that envelope left my hand my mother would be playing catch-up on a board she did not design, which is the only version of justice that ever lasts. The envelope to the bank went out first thing in the morning because I wanted the day to begin with a clock I did not have to wind, and as I walked from the post office I found myself grinning at how ordinary the building looked for a place that launches consequences. Then I headed to the passport agency with a folder of documents that would have impressed a cautious accountant, and while I waited beneath fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly unwell I rehearsed, not the speech I would give my mother, because speeches are for people who still think words convince, but the list of small administrative levers I would pull until her world tilted just enough for her to taste the feeling she calls discipline when doling it out to others and misfortune when it taps her on the shoulder. The agent processed my application with the brisk empathy of someone who has seen worse and handed me a timeline I could live with, which felt less like permission and more like a fuse length end. While I tucked the receipt into my folder, my phone flashed a calendar reminder I had set months earlier for the charity luncheon my mother chairs every spring. The one where she poses beside oversized checks and calls it community, while the community calls it publicity. And I realized with an almost childish thrill that the cancellation of my club autopay would intersect with the luncheon's final invoice in a way that felt like the universe had decided to be helpful for once. Before lunch, I walked 3 blocks to a small office above a tax preparer where a notary with soft hands stamped a simple letter on my behalf that stated, in very plain language, that my passport had been reported missing and that any person retaining it should deliver it to the precinct property clerk. And while the letter was not legally threatening, it carried the bureaucratic chill my mother understands better than moral arguments. So I hired a courier to deliver it to her door with. Signature required, the point being not drama but record, because records remain polite long after tempers forget their manners. Then, because revenge works best when it travels in pairs, I used my lunch hour to log into the scholarship fund that bears my grandmother's name at the local community college. A modest program my mother likes to mention as proof of her generosity, while privately regarding it as a tax deduction and an audience opportunity, and I made a donation in the exact amount I had once begged for to cover a final semester, designated it for students who had been promised family assistance that evaporated, added a note that the gift honored unseen endurance, and entered my mother's public email as the acknowledgement contact, which would ensure that the thank you letter, the photograph of a recipient, and the little plaque mailed with institutional enthusiasm would arrive addressed to her but crediting me, a small paper comet that would pass through her house and leave a tail she could not ignore. By mid-afternoon, Ethan called to say Mom wanted a family check-in at the restaurant where she knows the owner and therefore believes the walls will keep her version of events intact, and while every cell in my body wanted to refuse, I agreed with the same gentle tone she uses when she is baiting a trap, because I had 3 items to deliver and FaceTime makes documents sting. At the table, she began with a smile practiced like a signature and announced that she was concerned about my mental health, that travel was rash, that the bank would confirm there had been no wrongdoing if only I would stop stirring the pot. And when she slid a slice of lemon across the rim of my water as if this were still a mother-daughter lunch rather than a status meeting, I placed on the linen a copy of the compliance request stamped received, the notary letter she had already signed. And a printout from the club showing a past due balance with a pleasant note about reinstatement options, and I watched her pupils contract the way they do when a flash goes off in a dark room, followed by the quick evaluation of which lie would travel farthest before anyone checked the map. She tried on concern, then outrage, then weary disappointment, and when none fit comfortably, she reached for the performance that has rescued her since high school, the one where she laughs lightly and says I exaggerate because I always did, which is when I realized that the only way to speak to her is by arranging furniture she cannot move. So I told her, in a voice that would not startle a bird, that I was grateful she had found my passport because the police would take such good care of it during replacement, that the bank's auditor would follow policy and therefore need nothing from me but patience, and that I had finally understood the difference between being a daughter and being a prop, which is why the club would have to learn whether her presence was charm or credit card, and then, because revenge is sweetest when it uplifts someone who has never been invited to her table, I slid across the final paper a printed email from the college thanking me for the gift in my grandmother's memory and promising to introduce me to a student whose degree would be saved because families sometimes fail. And for a full breath, the table went soundless in that uncanny way large rooms go silent when a microphone dies, until she regained herself and said the money was hers to manage and that I was embarrassing her, which is a sentence she believes ends every debate, but in fact begins a new arithmetic in which embarrassment compounds monthly. When the waiter appeared with bread, I excused myself with a smile that cost me nothing and left the restaurant quietly, because there is a kind of exit that says more than a closing line ever could. And I walked to my car with the mild shiver that always follows an adrenaline dip, then drove to her house and, using the old key she never remembered to take back because she never imagined I would use it for anything other than delivering flowers. Placed on her immaculate kitchen counter a small, sealed envelope addressed in my neatest handwriting with a message on the flap that read, "Open when I am gone," not as melodrama, but as a boundary. Then laid beside it the photocopy of my passport loss report and the instructions for surrender, and finally, because every performance deserves a new audience, I repositioned the framed photograph of her at last year's luncheon so that it faced the sink rather than the room, a tiny tilt that would itch every time she reached for a glass. As I locked the door, I could hear my phone vibrating with the first volley of messages, and while I did not read them, I could imagine their contents, a sequence of escalation and rewrite and bargaining, all of which would have to reckon tomorrow with a courier at the precinct desk, a call from the club accountant, and a warm, earnest letter from a college thanking a daughter for honoring the grandmother who had loved her without conditions, after which I would pack with the steady hands of a person who has learned that sometimes leaving and revenge share the same gate, and the boarding pass prints in exactly the same font whether you run or you walk. On the morning I chose to leave, the city looked rinsed clean by an overnight rain that had cleared the air without managing to fix anything real. And as I zipped the final bag with the methodical care of a person who understands that once a door closes, the small forgotten things will take on epic proportions, I listened to the phone thrum with messages that multiplied in threads like ivy. My mother's voice notes swinging wildly from brittle sweetness to precise threats about legal remedies. My brother's texts combining guilt with logistics as he asked whether I had truly filed to be removed as his cosigner because his renewal meeting was scheduled for the end of the month. And one quiet voicemail from my father recorded in the driveway where the engine's idle made a low, apologetic hum, a message in which he said my name once, stopped, and then, with the barest scrape of courage I have ever heard from him, asked whether I needed a ride. I kept the message because a person should be allowed to hold proof that someone tried, even if they tried late, and I turned off the rest because I needed the kind of silence that lets you hear your own mind, which had become crowded with the echo of other people's versions of me and with the quick drum of my own plans finally stepping into daylight. I locked the apartment twice out of habit and tucked the replacement passport appointment receipt into the inner pocket of my coat where I could feel its neat rectangle against my ribs. Then left the key on the counter for the new tenant who would arrive next week with a box of pans and the relief of a person who has been on wait lists too long, because part of leaving is giving a stranger a softer landing than you were given. And as I closed the door, I felt the old key to my mother's house cold. In my palm, a small blade of metal that had been both invitation and leash, and without ceremony I slid it into an envelope addressed to the precinct property clerk along with the notarized letter she had already signed for. A bundle that would complete the chain of custody she hated precisely because it did not bend to charm. In the rideshare to the airport I reviewed, the way an accountant might reconcile a ledger at quarter's end, the various levers already pulled and the ones that would click into place after I passed through security, the audit envelope stamped and logged, the club account delinquency set to trigger a call to her direct line rather than mine, the scholarship acknowledgement routed to her inbox with my name in the subject line and my grandmother's in the salutation, the cosigner removal request moving through the lender's queue with the slow dignity of a process that answers to no one's drama, and a scheduled email drafted to a small, reputable law firm, explaining, in respectful, surgical prose, the need for a no-contact letter that would be sent while I was unavailable by phone, not as a threat, not as theater, but as a boundary drawn in ink that does not smear when someone cries on it. At the terminal I moved through the ritual of departure with a deliberate calm that felt like revenge by another name, printed a boarding pass with a destination my mother would never believe I could afford without her, checked the bag that held little more than clothes and documents and a pair of walking shoes, and carried on a tote with the paper bones of my new life arranged inside like an anatomical model, lease termination confirmation, bank correspondence, scholarship receipt, notary copies, travel itinerary, and the sealed letter I had written to Aunt Linda with my new number and an invitation to visit when she wanted to be somewhere no one edited her sentences. At the coffee stand, a woman ahead of me apologized 3 times for dropping a lid, and I recognized in her voice the old reflex to shrink before somebody calls it clumsy, and I surprised myself by handing her a fresh cup and telling her I had time, which was true in the practical sense and also true in the larger one. Because one gift leaving has already given me is a yard of breathing room that expands when I stop apologizing for using it. I had planned to sail through the last hour on that quiet, steady current, but near the gate my phone blinked with a message that made the ground tilt in a familiar way, a photo of the envelope I had left on my mother's counter, now open. Its contents fan like a magician's deck beside a saucer of lipstick-blotted tea, accompanied by a short line that said she would be happy to discuss the papers you are misunderstanding if I would be reasonable and come by after my flight was cancelled, which read like a threat and also like evidence of how deeply she believed the world bent for her, and for a breath I considered sprinting backward into the story just to slam the door harder. Instead, I forwarded the photo to the bank auditor with a clean note stating only that the materials in question had been accessed by a party currently under review in the matter of beneficiary harm. And I copied the precinct clerk with the time-stamped courier delivery confirmation for the passport letter. And then I turned my phone off because some consequences bloom best in the dark and because the plane had begun to board in the unhurried order of rows. When I reached the front of the line and handed over the passport card and the boarding pass, the agent glanced at the destination, looked back at me, and said with businesslike kindness that she hoped I would enjoy the long flight. And in that moment I understood that revenge had already done its work, not because my mother would suffer in any theatrical way, but because she would have to live inside a story she did not write, one with paper trails and professionals and locked doors and a daughter who no longer stood where she had been planted like decor. I walked down the jet bridge with the strange lightness of someone who is carrying exactly the right weight and sat by the window with my hands folded over the receipt in my pocket, and as the plane pulled back I imagined, without deciding whether the image comforted or haunted me, the way my mother might be sitting in her spotless kitchen holding my letter in one hand and her phone in the other, wondering whether the envelope I left contained the thing that could break her or the thing that could save her, and whether I would ever tell her which one it was, and as the wheels left the ground I let the answer stay where it belonged, suspended somewhere between cloud and runway. A truth that would not land until I chose to watch it touch down.